Hello, and welcome to the Chapter 14, Part 1 lecture on Mendelian Genetics. You should use the information in this lecture to complete the Chapter 14, Part 1 guided notes, which of course you should complete before you come to class. In this chapter, we're going to discuss genetics, also known as inheritance. And this is the process by which genes are passed from a parental generation to the offspring. In a previous chapter, we discussed gene expression, and we talked about how cells can turn genes on or off to control that gene expression. In this chapter, we're going to focus more on how the combinations of genes that you get from your parents can affect gene expression. Different variations of genes interact in different patterns, and so we can use this information to make predictions. For instance, we might say if a blue-eyed person and a brown-eyed person have some kids, what will the eye color of their kids be like? Incidentally, brown-eyed genes tend to dominate over blue-eyed genes. So if a brown-eyed person and a blue-eyed person get together, it's likely that all of their children will have brown eyes. But there are a number of different ways that these alleles can interact with each other, and we're going to talk about that in this chapter. In this first part of the chapter, we're going to discuss Mendelian genetics. Gregor Mendel, or Mendel, was a monk that lived in the late 1800s in what is today the Czech Republic, and he is considered the father of genetics. In those days, it was not uncommon for men of the church to do scientific research on the side, and that's what Mendel did. He was most passionate about botany, and specifically, he really liked working with pea plants. So what he did was carefully breed together pea plants, and he would carefully keep track of the characteristics of the parents and the offspring. And more importantly, he took very careful notes on all of these characteristics and how they traveled from one generation to the next. He did this over a period of years and worked with something like 28,000 pea plants during that time. And so from all of this information, he was able to divine or put together the basic patterns of genetics that still hold true today. So that's why he's considered the father of genetics. For his experiments, Mendel would choose a particular characteristic to track from one generation to the next in his pea plants. So for instance, in this experiment, he was looking at flower color. Now for this first set of experiments, he chose what he called pure breeding or true breeding plants. And a purebred plant is one that, when self-fertilized, will only produce the same characteristics in subsequent generations. So in other words, if you take one of these purple plants and you breed it with itself, which is something you can do with plants, it will only produce purple offspring. He also took plants that were pure breeding for this white flower characteristic. In other words, if you breed this white flower to itself, it only produces white offspring. And then he decided he was going to breed them to each other to see what would happen. So he took a pure breeding purple plant and a pure breeding white plant and bred them together. This first little experiment produced some surprising results. Mendel was breeding together two true breeding flowers, and this first generation he referred to as the P generation, or parental generation. He found that when he bred together two pure breeding flowers, that in the first set of offspring, which he called F1s, or first filial generation, that the white characteristic disappeared. In other words, when he bred together true breeding purple with true breeding white, he got purple flowers for that entire generation. He then decided to take two of those purple flowers and breed them together and produce the next generation, which he called the F2s. And when he did that, lo and behold, there were some white flowers in that generation. So that white characteristic disappeared for one generation, but showed up again in the next generation. He repeated this experiment many, many times, and from this he got consistent results and was able to conclude that these genes, these characteristics, are passed from one generation to the next in very specific patterns. He was also able to determine that some characteristics are what he called dominant over others. In other words, some characteristics are more likely to show up in hybrids, in mixtures of these genes, than others. Mendel worked with a number of different characteristics in pea plants over the years, and he was able to determine that many of these characteristics behaved by the dominant recessive pattern that he had seen in flower color. So he looked at all sorts of things. He looked at the arrangement of the flowers on the stems, the shape and color of the peas themselves, the shape of the pea pods, and even the height of the flower. He found that all these characteristics played by these rules. Now keep in mind, Mendel didn't know anything about DNA or genes or chromosomes or any of those modern discoveries. He referred to these different characteristics simply as characters, and he could describe how they were passed from one generation to the next. But he didn't know anything about the mechanics of why that happened. Today, of course, we do know a thing or two about DNA and chromosomes and genes, and so we can use these modern discoveries to back up Mendel's rules. They provide a physical explanation for how these characters, as Mendel would say, travel from one generation to the next. We know, for instance, that genes code for these different characters, and that you have many, many, many different genes. We also know that the genes ride on the chromosomes. They are carried by the chromosomes. Diploid cells are going to contain two copies of every gene, and that's because one of them is maternal and one of them is paternal, and they exist in these pairs called homologous chromosomes. Now, the maternal gene and the paternal gene may differ just a little bit from one another. For instance, if this little gene up here is for eye color, maybe mom give you the gene for blue eyes and dad give you the gene for brown eyes. So they're not entirely identical, and it's actually the interaction between those two sets of genes that makes you you. The presence of one gene can affect the expression of the other gene, and that can make some unique combinations. Gametes, including egg and sperm, are haploid by comparison, and that means that inside an egg or a sperm cell that your body might produce, there's only going to be one copy of chromosome 1, one copy of chromosome 2, and so on. They don't exist in pairs. Now, when your body makes that egg or sperm cell, because they're only going to pass on one of those chromosomes, that means that there's only going to be one copy of each gene present instead of two. Whether it represents the maternal gene that you originally inherited or the paternal gene, we don't know. There's really a random chance of passing on either one. And remember that because of the way meiosis works and because of crossing over, that each of these chromosomes actually represents a combination of your maternal and paternal DNA. The different versions or variations of a gene that exist are referred to as alleles. Let's take eye color as an example. The most common alleles for eye color are brown eyes and blue eyes. But there are other alleles that exist. Some people are born with purple eyes, for instance, or even yellowy looking eyes. Those are all alleles for that gene. Now, the genes are inherited in pairs. So that means that potentially you can inherit the same allele for a gene. For instance, let's say you inherited the blue eye gene from both parents. Or it's possible to inherit two different alleles for a particular gene. Let's say that this gene down here is for hair texture, and maybe one parent gave you the allele for straight hair, and the other parent gave you the allele for curly hair. You can get two different alleles for that gene, and they have to interact with each other to produce you. Individuals who inherit the same allele for a characteristic from both parents are referred to as being homozygous for that characteristic. Homo means same, and zygous refers to that fertilized egg. In other words, if we could see inside that fertilized egg, we'd see the same allele on both chromosomes for that characteristic. If an individual inherits two different alleles for a particular gene, we say they are heterozygous for that particular gene or at that particular locus. Hetero means different, and zygous refers to the fertilized egg. So it means that they are different within that fertilized egg. Different alleles have different patterns of expression. Alleles that we refer to as being dominant are always expressed when they are inherited. So in other words, if you inherit a dominant allele for a particular characteristic from just one of your parents, it's going to show up in you physically. Let's use Mendel's pea plants as an example of this. One of the characteristics that Mendel examined were the flower colors in his plants, and he was breeding together purple flowers with white flowers. He found that when he bred white and purple parents together, that the next generation contained only purple flowers, and that the white characteristic disappeared. So he declared that the purple characteristic, the purple allele, was dominant over the white characteristic. Recessive alleles are only expressed in the absence of a dominant allele. This means that they have to be inherited from both parents in order to show up physically. In Mendel's pea plants, white flowers were considered recessive to the purple flowers because white flowers showed up less commonly. Now, why is it that some alleles dominate over other alleles? Well, there can be many explanations, and it really depends on what that gene actually does, what its function is inside the cell. In the case of the pea plants, the recessive allele for white flowers tells that flower to not lay down any pigment. So the absence of pigment means that that flower is going to turn out white. On the other hand, the purple allele tells the flower to lay down purple pigment. So if that individual inherits only one dominant allele, it's still going to lay down purple pigment, and the flower is still going to turn out purple instead of white. The genes that an individual actually inherits is referred to as its genotype, and we refer to the genotype using capital and lowercase letters. In the dominant recessive system, there are three possible genotypes that an individual can have. If the individual inherits two dominant genes, two dominant alleles from each parent, we say they are homozygous dominant. In the case of the purple and white flowers, we would say they have the genotype big P, and they would end up with purple flowers. If the individual inherits one dominant and one recessive characteristic, big P, little p, we would say that they are heterozygous for that characteristic, and they would still end up with purple flowers because of that dominant allele. The third possible genotype is referred to as homozygous recessive. This occurs when the individual inherits two recessive genes from each parent. So in the case of Mendel's flowers, this individual would be little p, and would have white flowers. The genotype that an individual has for a particular characteristic occurs on the DNA. And so we can't see that. We can't see the genes that an individual actually has, although we can make some assumptions about it sometimes. On the other hand, the phenotype represents the actual physical expression of those genes. So these are things we can see. We describe the phenotype for an individual using different kinds of descriptive words or adjectives. So things like purple flowers, white flowers, tall plants, short plants, wrinkled peas versus rounded peas. Those are the kinds of terms we use for phenotypes. Now, in the basic dominant recessive system, there are two phenotypes that can occur. There's the dominant phenotype and the recessive phenotype. In the case of the pea plants, the dominant phenotype would be purple flowers. Now, that could occur because of either the homozygous or heterozygous genotype, but we can't see those genotypes. So the phenotype itself is purple flowers. The recessive phenotype in this case is white flowers. That can only occur because of the homozygous recessive genotype, but again, we can't really see those genes inside. So we would refer to the phenotype as being white flowers. I want you to take a few minutes and practice using these terms. And for this exercise, we're going to look at earlobe shape. Now, there are actually many different variations on earlobes that exist, but the two most common are referred to as the free earlobe and the attached earlobe. The free earlobe comes down and goes back up and leaves a little space between the earlobe and the head, whereas the attached earlobe goes straight down to the side of the head. The free earlobe is considered dominant over the attached earlobe. So what I want you to do is take a minute and look in the mirror and determine which kind of earlobe you have, what genotypes you might possibly have, and what phenotype you have. Now remember, if you have the dominant phenotype, the free earlobe, you can have two possible genotypes. You can be big F, or big F, little f. And that's because that dominant is going to dominate even if it shows up in combination with the recessive. And since we can't see inside your genes, we don't know which one you have.